Salams from the People's Dispatch studio in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. We have quite a fun show actually today. We're examining the UK Foreign Secretary's statements coming from Australia. We're talking about Havana Syndrome and we're looking at the latest in the use of the Pegasus spyware. First up, Britain has warned Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping on Friday that its allies would stand together to fight for democracy against dictatorships that it said were more emboldened than at any time since the Cold War. Speaking in Australia, like I mentioned before, British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said Britain and its allies in the free world must respond together to global threats, deepen ties with democracies in the Indo-Pacific, and face down global aggressors who were using economic dependence to try and get what they want. Truss and Ben Wallace, the UK's Defence Secretary, are in Sydney for discussions with the Australian government over closer security ties following the signing of AUKUS last year, which is a pact between London, Canberra and Washington DC, and was designed to enable Australia to obtain nuclear-powered submarines as part of an effort to counteract what it calls an increasingly assertive China. Prashant, using economic might or power to get what you want, where have we heard this concept before?
Right, Siddhant. Good question, because it's highly ironic that the UK is making these statements because, as we know, the United States and the United Kingdom have been in the forefront of imposing sanctions on countries across the world. It's innumerable the number of countries who face various kinds of sanctions. It could be on individuals, it could be on the government per se, and the disastrous impact it has had on the lives of millions of people, starting from Syria, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, very well documented cases of number of deaths taking place due to sanctions. So in this context, the British Foreign Secretary talking about other countries, she's referring obviously to China here, using economic dependence to push their agenda is really rich. But I think this actually boils down to a more fundamental issue that is really determining global geopolitics, that China's rise as a massive commercial power and as a powerhouse, economic powerhouse, has led to a situation where a lot of countries around the world have very strong economic ties with China. And the United States and the United Kingdom and the Western powers in general see this as a threat to the world order that has been established under their hegemony over in recent times. And so their standard response really has been to sort of stigmatize these economic relations, although there is no real sign of China using these economic ties as hardcore leverage. It is pursuing economic ties, there's no doubt about it. It is pursuing strong economic relations with a number of countries, and there's a give and take involved in these countries. But for instance, there's very little sign of any
arm twisting.
Not only arm twisting, even arms for that matter, of a military presence, unlike say the United States, for instance. They do have a base in Djibouti, but other than that, there's not much sign of the Chinese establishing a vast military presence, for instance, or forcing leaders to bow to their needs or etc., anything of that sort. So it's interesting this is happening in Australia, where China and Australia are the big, China is Australia's biggest economic partner. On the other hand, Australia is unwilling to commit to a relationship with China which involves mutual respect, because it is politically more aligned to the West. So we have this awkward kind of a space where, in terms of there is a strong economic partnership, and even the restrictions China did impose on Australia were after Australia made those claims, those horrible claims which have been going around the world, that China was responsible for COVID-19, right? So, asking for an investigation into its origins, basically hinting at the same, that China was responsible. So I think this is the larger global context. So there are two aspects to it. I think one is the massive irony of the United Kingdom saying this, considering the centuries of exploitation, the use of sanctions. The second, of course, is the fact that I think there is in the Western lack of understanding on how to deal with China's economic growth, how to deal with the new relations China is establishing with various countries. And so they're basically accusing China of what they have been doing all these years and all these decades, and for that matter, all these centuries. So in one sense, like I said, so it's actually pretty not at all remarkable that these comments are made.
Yeah, which takes us nicely into the second part of our conversation. She made a clear distinction between democracies and dictatorships. How do you view that in the present context?
Right. So it's the oldest trope. It's a very old trope in recent times. From the Cold War onwards, the notion of the free world, like you mentioned, the notion of democracies fighting authoritarian dictatorships. The first it was the communists, then it is whoever. And it's a whole. It's a very well-known trope. Nonetheless, it's been revitalized and brought out. Like every time you sort of need to inject the zombie with some fresh. Give the zombie some fresh sustenance, so to speak. So this is one of those instances. We saw Biden's summit to democracies in December. Now let's complicate this narrative. On the one hand, we do know, for instance, that, and it's important to talk about this because the people of Yemen are now without internet after the Saudi bombing yesterday. Britain and the United States have been major supporters of the Saudi war on Yemen. Is Saudi Arabia a democracy? Obviously not. It is a hardcore monarchy, it's very clear monarchy. So are its allies in West Asia. Is Israel, Israel on the other hand is technically a democracy, but what has it been doing? Let's look at the puppet states in Latin America, which were the military puppet states in Latin America, which were propped up by the UAE, the US and the UK for decades. The kind of subversion they have undertaken against democratically elected governments. For instance, we do know that against the government of Venezuela, for instance, Venezuelan gold is still lying in British banks. And Venezuela has seen some of the most number of elections among many countries, I think 20 plus elections in recent times. So there's no doubt about the democratic process there. They've been certified as well. The coup in Bolivia when Evo Morales was winning, again strongly backed by the US and its allies. Right. So we have this whole gamut of violation of democracy by the United States, United Kingdom and its allies. So it's highly ironic that again, you posit, but it's a convenient, rhetorical tool to sort of paint yourself as virtuous and your enemies as these kind of mechanical, machinistic tyrants. Whereas obviously geopolitics is far more complicated, relations are far more complicated. But like I said, this is a good rhetorical device, a good stick to beat your rivals with, instead of, say, working with them or cooperating with them. So, on the one hand, I think it's essential, and it's a farce. There's no other really way of describing it. On the other hand, it's important to note that just the decades and decades of repeating this has had an impact in the way people think. And I think it's very essential that people also try to sort of figure out the limitations of, not just limitations, the complete nonsensical nature of this concept of the free world versus the enslaved world, or democracy and free speech versus authoritarianism. And these are absolutely completely bogus terms, so to speak, especially considering the record of and we're not going into the past, we're not going into colonialism. Even if we take the time of the Cold War onwards, the sheer amount of blood spilled by the West is pretty much incalculable. So very, of course, pure rhetoric, of course, pure rabble-rousing, but nonetheless a very dangerous form of rabble-rousing.
Yeah, it's like you were pointing out before the show, it's like a skit from Yes Minister, but with like very dark undertones. Right, but which takes us to our next story, for which I'll ask you to hang around, because the Cold War rhetoric seems to be back in full flow. We're talking about Havana Syndrome. After months of speculation and reports, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States has concluded that US diplomats suffering from what it has called Havana Syndrome were not actually targeted by any foreign power. Over the past 5 years, thousands of alleged cases of the mystery condition have been reported by diplomats, spies and other US officials, posted in places as diverse as Vienna, Paris, Geneva, Beijing and of course Havana. According to a report in the New York Times, 1,000 cases reviewed by US investigators were explainable. The CIA has concluded that these cases can be sort of written off to or attributed to environmental causes, undiagnosed medical conditions or stress, and not by foreign power action. However, the spy agency remains unfettered in its efforts. NPR quoted an unnamed CIA source as saying, "Some of our toughest cases remain unresolved," while also adding, "We have so far not found evidence of state actor involvement in any incident." Prashant, I don't think I really even need to ask you a question.
I know. Today is one of those days where, the topics are such that on the one hand you're thinking, how are we talking about this in a news show? On the other hand, they are such that you can't not talk about them either, absolutely. Right? So, this is a classic example. You see, Havana Syndrome, it starts in 2016, peak Trump era paranoia and the classic nonsense that was going on around that time. All kinds of theories about secret weapons developed. And of course, the important thing to note is within the short period, the number of people who could have developed these weapons was first it was Cuba, then it was Russia, then it was China, or it was China, it was Russia, in that order, whatever. So, all the usual suspects were accused of developing weapons which could target US diplomats and cause these symptoms where there was headaches, dizziness, all kinds of stuff. And the question was, are they using radio waves in a particular way? Microwaves, exactly. And time and again, the scientific community said that it was impossible to develop these kind of devices. Say some of the descriptions would have required devices which caused far more greater symptoms or even burnt your skin before it could produce the impacts that the diplomats were claiming. And it's very important to note that I think the Cubans have been extremely cooperative. Like, imagine this, the US embassy, US diplomats basically saying that your host country is using secret weapons against you. And the Cubans actually took up their claims, conducted studies, Cuban doctors, Cuban experts, all of them participated and actually debunked these claims very systematically and very scientifically. And time and again it was pointed out that these are just probably symptoms of, first of all, let's make it very clear. The important thing is that these were probably, at least in Cuba, these were probably crickets or cicadas. The screeching noise that they make is what these diplomats are supposed to have heard, because they heard some noise which caused these symptoms. That was the Havana Syndrome, right? So, based on the recordings, the most logical conclusion was that these were actually crickets or cicadas. Now, of course, once this took off, it became a whole different thing altogether. And this, by the way, had consequences, because diplomatic consequences. For instance, the US withdrew diplomatic staff from Korea. I think it expelled the Cuban diplomats. I'm not sure about the ambassador, but it did expel Cuban diplomats as well. So, and then we saw this, this whole Cold War full-style paranoia for years and years, an entire industry dedicated to speculating, huge amount of resources spent on investigating, again, thousands of cases, as you said. And now we see that almost all of them have been dismissed as having no external factor in this, and they've been inexplicable, right? Now, I think this really sort of illustrates the absurdity of the US state and US politics at this point of time, and the fact that so much amount of time and energy and effort was actually spent on fighting these invisible, mysterious, spy novel-ish enemies who were using these super weapons from I think the Cuban ambassador said that next we're going to hear about UFOs. So I think that adequately
I think we are already hearing about UFOs as well, but maybe not on this show. So the top spy there, William Burns, who's the director of the agency, has said that we are not done. Quite categorically, it means this investigation is likely to continue. More resources will be devoted to it, despite the overwhelming evidence, medical evidence, sort of dismissing these or explaining these cases. Actually,
I know.
Take it away.
No. I think that, like I said, even continuing from like what we said, like one, of course, the fact that these resources are being expended to such an extent, as opposed to being used for the people of the United States, a scandal. And secondly, I think this just sort of heightens the global paranoia that is being built up in a multiple number of ways. Heightens this sense of antagonism that is being sort of built up among countries. Now, that is the job of intelligence agencies. We can say that. But nonetheless, when it goes into these kind of dimensions, I think it's completely absurd. The fact that crickets or the sound caused by crickets could lead to a diplomatic issue really shows, in some senses, how fragile the United States, the relationships the United States are with countries across the world. For instance, apparently William Burns' aide also suffered something similar while they were in India. So question was it the Indians? Was it Russian spies in India? Was it the Chinese infiltrating the Indian security detail? It's, there's no end to this.
All of the above.
Yeah, exactly.
So the other interesting thing that William Burns did say was that they are committed to providing world-class healthcare. And at least one case of someone being evacuated from Switzerland to the United States to receive care for Havana Syndrome. Am I missing something about
Well, again, like I said, I think that, there are multiple explanations for this, many of them medical, many of them stress-related. I think there's one, if I'm not mistaken, which actually talks about the impact of stress having, manifesting itself what is earlier called mass hysteria. Now there's a far more, more scientific term. Mass hysteria is a problematic one. But for instance, a lot of this, the way many of these symptoms, many of these reports have occurred, have actually manifested, have confirmed, or or match what happens in such circumstances. People feeling besieged. For instance, U.S. diplomats in Cuba being sent there and being told that you're surrounded by enemies, you're in a state of war, you're basically our frontline soldiers, you're diplomats. So you can understand this kind of a situation. And let's be clear, of course, it's not the Cubans who have been launching a war against the Americans. It's the Americans who have been kept mounted a blockade, have refused to remove it despite multiple requests, etc., etc. So
and international law.
Yeah, and international law, etc. So I think all of this together paints, at one level, like the last answer, it's a complete farce. The fact it's almost laughable to some extent. And this is acknowledging the fact that a lot of these diplomats may be unwell for a variety of reasons, and nobody's dismissing the fact that they're unwell or they're suffering in various ways. But this kind of an explanation is definitely highly dubious. But on the other hand, I think we need to also keep this incident in mind, purely because of what it reflects on the global scenario today.
All right. That does it for our Spy versus Spy segment on this Friday show. Thanks very much, Prashant. Our final story, of course, is not really absurd at all. 2 female human rights activists in Bahrain and Jordan were the victims of the Israeli NSO group's notorious spyware Pegasus, an investigation by frontline defenders revealed on Monday. The software was meant for criminals and terrorists, but Ebtissam Al-Saig and Hala Ahed Deeb joined the growing list of human rights activists and journalists worldwide found to have been targeted. The scandal erupted when reporters revealed the scheme last July in an investigation that became known as the Pegasus Project. I spoke earlier to Abdul of People's Dispatch via video conference.
Right, Abdul, so thanks for joining us. First of all, Al-Saig and Deeb, the 2 activists who have been targeted, what exactly was the work that they were doing that made them targets for Pegasus or whoever targeted them using Pegasus?
Well, their targeting confirms the general pattern which we have seen throughout the world. These are the activists who have basically bothered the establishment through their activism. So they're basically both Sage and Deeb are basically human rights activists who have both of them are active in countries which are not known for freedom of different kinds of freedom and human right, respect for human right. So in Bahrain, we have known that how, particularly after the Arab Spring, the opposition politicians, the opposition people who are opposed to the authoritarian, non-democratic regime in the country have been targeted by the establishment. So the Sage basically fights for their rights. Of course, she is not liked by the establishment. That is quite obvious. Similar thing is with Deeb. She is basically a lawyer who fights the cases on behalf of the Jordanian Teachers Syndicate, which basically is a union. Of course, in Jordan, as I said before, the rights of the working class, right of the other people who demand certain freedom are not respected, and therefore those who fight on their behalf are targeted. So this basically fits in the pattern. This has been the case all over the world, wherever the Pegasus has been, the use of Pegasus has been exposed. Yeah.
Right. The OCCRP has quoted Al-Saig as saying, this is a complete, my freedom is over. I'm not safe at home, on the street, or anywhere else. What course of action do people targeted by Pegasus, particularly in this case, have?
So far, what we have known that only the governments concerned can take recourse. Most of the governments are in denial that they don't use it officially. So legally speaking, strictly speaking, particularly in countries like Bahrain, UAE, and Jordan, I don't think there is any legal recourse available for them. Because their governments have not accepted the allegations, and anyway, the larger when it comes to protection of right of the citizens, these countries have no great record on. Yeah. So even in countries where there has been some kind of legal recourse, there is legal recourse available, like in countries in Europe, say for example UK or France. Even there, since the governments have completely denied their involvement, it is very difficult for the activists to basically go to the court and say that they have. So that, I think, in this circumstance, is very difficult for them to take any legal recourse. The only thing which can have some kind of protection, which can bring some kind of protection to them, is basically more and more basically making these issues more and more public. Basically creating an international pressure. That also will help to a very limited extent only. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Abdul, for that update.
That's all we have on the show for today. From the entire People's Dispatch team and myself, thank you very much for watching. For more on these stories and all the work we do at People's Dispatch, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms. We'll be back with a Saturday show tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.